A bronze anvil hangs suspended in the height of the heavens, motionless for one long moment before it falls. That is the image Hesiod reaches for when he wants to describe how far below everything the underworld lies. Not a number, not a comparison to any landmark a traveler might recognize, but a bronze anvil released from the highest point imaginable, dropping through darkness so vast that 9 full days and 9 full nights will pass before it strikes the floor of the world below. The mind does not so much grasp that distance as rest inside it, the way the eye rests on a very clear horizon without needing to calculate how far away it is. The anvil falls, the days pass, the darkness beneath it has no equivalent above. Hesiod was writing in the 8th century BCE in a poem called the Theogony, which is to say, the genealogy of the gods, the account of how divine things came to be in the order they came to be. The Theogony is a poem of distances and origins, of beginnings that stretch back past memory into something that feels less like the past and more like the deep structure beneath the past. And within that poem, the underworld is not described as a place of story or encounter or even of fear. It is described as a place of position. This is where it is. Here is how far. Here is what it sits below. The underworld, in Hesiod, is a cosmological fact. It has a location. It has dimensions. Its distance from the surface of the earth is given with the same matter-of-fact precision one might use to describe the distance between two cities, except that the unit of measurement is a falling bronze anvil and 9 days of dark. What makes that image so particular is not the weight of the anvil or the sound it makes when it lands. It is the duration. 9 days is long enough that a person listening to the poem would have to hold the image in mind, not as a flash of sudden distance, but as a sustained, ongoing fall, the object dropping steadily through absolute dark, passing no landmarks, approaching no visible floor, simply continuing downward through the long middle of the time it takes. The underworld is not just below, it is very far below, and that distance, Hesiod seems to suggest, is part of what the underworld is, a quality of its nature as much as a statement about its geography. The upper surface of the earth in Hesiod's cosmology is the world that mortals walk and gods visit, and the sun crosses each day in his chariot. Below it lies the underworld, and below the underworld, at a further distance equal to the first, another bronze anvil, another 9 days, lies Tartarus, the deepest region, the uttermost dark, the place into which the Titans were cast after their defeat. The structure is a vertical arrangement, a cosmos organized by depth, and the underworld occupies its precise middle position between the surface and whatever is most deeply buried beneath everything else. It is not infinite. It has its layers and its levels, and at the very bottom of it all, sealed below even the realm of the dead, the defeated gods of the previous age, lie in the specific dark of a place that has a measurable distance from the world above. There is something calming about that arrangement, the way it makes the cosmos into something organized rather than simply endless. The world has a top, a middle, and a floor. The living world is in the middle. The sky above it and the underworld below it are each a 9-day anvil fall away from where mortals stand. The universe of the Theogony has edges and layers, and the particular quality of stability that comes from something having been placed exactly where it belongs, at a distance that has been measured, in a position from which it does not move. The entrance to the underworld, or rather one of its entrances, appears in Homer's Odyssey, and it is approached not by descending into the earth, but by sailing to the very edge of the world. Odysseus, in the 10th book of the Odyssey, receives instructions from the sorceress Circe, who tells him he must sail to the land of the Cimmerians in order to reach the border of the realm of the dead. The Cimmerians were a people living at the world's rim, at the outermost boundary of the inhabited earth, beneath a mist so permanent and so thick that the sun's light had never once reached them. Not a cloudy day, not a long winter of short light. The sun had simply never shone there at all. The Cimmerians lived their entire lives under fog, in a perpetual and stable dimness that was not night. The night had its own character, its stars, its movements, but was instead a condition entirely its own, neither light nor dark, with the particular quality of something that has always been this way and will not change. Homer describes the place in a few spare lines, but the image he gives is complete. Black poplars grow near the entrance, willows stand among them, their leaves narrow and pale, the water nearby is dark. The air has the quality of early morning in a deep valley, except that the morning does not progress toward noon. There is no noon here. The ships of Odysseus arrive, and the crew moor the vessel and walk through a landscape that feels already transitional, a place between the world they left and the world they have not yet entered, where the geography of the living world begins, without drama, to give way to something else. The land of the Cimmerians is the last solid ground before the border dissolves. What Homer does with this geography is of a piece with how he builds much of the Odyssey. The world grows stranger at its edges, not suddenly, but progressively. Each stage of Odysseus's travels moving him one step further from the recognizable center, the warm sea and the populated islands and the ordinary weather of the Mediterranean, toward coasts where the normal rules have quietly loosened. The Cimmerians are not monstrous. Their land is not a place of active terror. It is simply a place where the sun does not come, where the mist stays, where the poplars and willows grow near dark water, and where, somewhere just beyond, the border of the underworld runs. The geography of the Odyssey treats the underworld's entrance not as a rupture in the world's surface, but as a region that belongs to the world's edge, the way any remote country belongs to the edge of any map, further than most people go, beyond the usual routes, but reachable by a determined traveler who has been given the right instructions. Odysseus does not descend into the earth in the Odyssey. He sails to the edge of the world, digs a pit, and pours libations and offerings into it, and the shades of the dead rise from below to gather at the edge of the pit and drink the dark blood of the sacrificed animals. The underworld reaches up to meet him. He does not need to go all the way down. The membrane between the living world and the dead world, at this edge place, is thin enough that the voices of the dead carry through it, and the forms of those who have died can rise near enough to the surface to be seen and spoken with, as long as there is something to drink. The name of the darkness through which souls first passed upon entering the underworld was Erebus. Erebus is old, older, in Hesiod's genealogy of divine things, than almost anything else. In the Theogony, Hesiod describes chaos as the first thing, the gap or void at the very beginning, and from chaos came Erebus, darkness, specifically the darkness of the deep earth and the underworld, and night, his sister, born alongside him from the same first opening. Erebus and night then came together, and from them were born Aether, the bright upper air of the heavens, and Hemera, the day. Darkness gave birth to light. Night gave birth to day. The Theogony's account of the cosmos begins with this precise sequence of reversals, this lineage in which the oldest things are also the darkest things, and from them the brighter things proceed. But Erebus is not only a divine figure in Hesiod's genealogy. His name was also given to a place, the uppermost region of the underworld, the first zone that souls entered after crossing the boundary of the living world. As a place, Erebus was not understood to be simply total darkness. It was something more particular than that. It was a graduated dimming, a zone where the last traces of the light of the living world, which had perhaps reached even this far in the thinnest possible form, slowly dissolved entirely into something that had no equivalent above ground. Not the darkness of a windowless room, not the darkness of a closed eye. The darkness of Erebus was understood to be its own specific thing, a darkness that belonged to that place and no other, a darkness that marked the transition between the world of the living and the world of the dead with the thoroughness of something that was itself one of the oldest things that had ever existed. To pass through Erebus was to pass through the name of one of the first beings born from chaos. The geography of the underworld and the genealogy of the gods were in this particular overlap the same thing. The place bore the name of the being whose nature it expressed. Erebus, the region of graduated darkness, was called by the name of Erebus, the divine presence of that darkness, and the two were understood to be connected in the way that a river's name might recall the god who ran through it, not identical, but of the same nature, belonging to the same deep arrangement. Before there was a god named Hades, or a realm called by his name, there was this Erebus, the first dark, the passage at the top of the underworld through which the dead moved, the zone where the last memory of light above ground was quietly extinguished as souls moved further down. The underworld began here, not with walls or gates or a sudden change in the character of the ground, but with a gradual dimming that was itself one of the oldest things in existence. The darkness did not arrive. The darkness had always been there, waiting, the way Hesiod says it was there at the very beginning, before the light existed at all. There came a moment in the history of the cosmos, after the defeat of the Titans, after the long war between the old generation of gods and the new, after the world had been won and needed to be divided, when three brothers stood together and drew lots to determine which portion of the world each would govern. The three brothers were Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, sons of the Titan Cronus and his wife Rhea. They had grown up in unusual circumstances, swallowed by their father at birth, because Cronus had received a prophecy that his children would one day overthrow him, and then retrieved when Rhea deceived Cronus into swallowing a stone instead of the youngest child Zeus, who grew up in hiding on Crete, and eventually returned to free his siblings from inside their father's body by giving him an emetic prepared by the goddess Metis. The three brothers, along with their sisters, and eventually with other allies, fought the Titans for 10 years in a war called the Titanomachy. They won. Cronus and the other Titans were cast down into Tartarus. The world was theirs. The division by lot is described in Homer's Iliad, in a passage where Poseidon speaks to Apollo and reminds him of how the world came to be arranged as it is. 3 portions were available: the sky, with its light and its heights and its particular kind of sovereignty over everything below; the sea, wide and deep, moving across the great portion of the world's surface it covered, and the earth's interior, pressing downward beneath everything else, the entire subterranean world, with all its rivers and regions and the souls of every human being who had ever died or would ever die. The earth's surface itself and Olympus were common ground, belonging to no single brother as their private domain. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, Hades drew the third portion, the one that pressed downward, the one that lay in the dark below the earth, where the anvil had fallen, and where it continued to press further downward toward Tartarus, toward the bottommost floor of the world. The lot was drawn, and the division was made, and from that moment The arrangement of the cosmos was settled into the configuration that the Greeks would describe and elaborate and build their underworld traditions upon for centuries afterward. What is worth sitting with in that image, the three brothers, the lots drawn, the world divided, is the clarity of the moment it describes. Before the lots were drawn, the cosmos had been won, but not yet organized. The war was over, the Titans were in Tartarus, but the world was still waiting to be properly arranged, still existing without its permanent order, still in the condition of something completed but not yet distributed. And then the lots were drawn. One moment, and the world had its permanent shape. Zeus above, Poseidon across the sea, Hades below, the sun where it had always been, the sea where it had always been, and below everything, the realm of the dead, belonging now to the brother whose portion it had become. There is no suggestion in the sources that Hades was disappointed by this draw. Later traditions sometimes read reluctance into his portion, the realm without sunlight, without the sky's clarity, without the open water's movement, but the oldest sources are matter of fact about it. The lots were drawn, the world was divided, the cosmos settled into its arrangement and stayed there. Hades went to the realm that was his and became its ruler and remained there, governing it with the thoroughness of a god whose entire attention was on his domain. The image of those three brothers standing at the moment of the cosmic lottery is one of the organizing images of Greek cosmological thought, the moment when the world's vertical structure was matched to the gods who would govern each of its levels, when the arrangement that had perhaps been implicit in the Theogony's account of chaos and Erebus and night became explicit and assigned and permanent, above, across, below, sky, sea, and the deep earth, and in the deep earth, everything that died. Centuries after Hesiod and Homer, in Athens, a philosopher named Plato turned his attention to the underworld not as a poet constructing images of its terrain, but as a thinker attempting to understand what happened to the soul after death. Plato wrote 3 dialogues, the Phaedo, the Republic, and the Gorgias, in each of which the geography and the moral structure of the underworld are developed with a precision and an organizational clarity that distinguished his accounts from anything that had come before. The older accounts were images. They were a bronze anvil falling. There were the black poplars of the Cimmerian shore and the mist that did not lift. They were the graduated darkness of Erebus and the 3 brothers and their lots. These images were cosmologically serious, but they were not systematic. They did not explain how souls were evaluated, or why they went to particular places rather than others, or how the different regions of the underworld related to each other as part of a single organized geography. Hesiod and Homer gave the underworld its depth and its entrance and its characteristic darkness. Plato gave it its structure. Imagine a scholar in an ancient library, not the vast library of Alexandria, which had not yet been built, but a smaller library in Athens in the 4th century BCE, in a room where scrolls were kept in clay jars or wooden cases, and light came from oil lamps that made the smoke curl upward toward the ceiling. The scholar unrolls a copy of the Phaedo, Plato's dialogue about the death of Socrates and the immortality of the soul, and reads toward the end of the dialogue, where the text shifts from argument into myth, where Plato, through the voice of Socrates, describes the geography of the underworld with a specificity that no previous text had attempted. The Phaedo's account describes rivers flowing through the underworld in specific relationships to each other, regions differentiated by their moral character and the quality of the souls who inhabit them, roads that branch at specific points toward different destinations, and the Akarushan Lake as a place of waiting and of the particular process by which souls moved from one stage of their journey to the next. The account is organized. It has the quality of something that has been thought through, where the parts relate to each other in ways that make sense, where the geography is not arbitrary, but is instead the expression of a moral and cosmological logic that the reader can follow. The Republic adds the myth of a soldier who died in battle and was returned to life, and who traveled through the underworld and came back to report what he had seen, the meadow where souls arrived, the pillars of light that marked the routes to heaven and to the depths below, the lot drawing that assigned souls their next life, the plane of forgetfulness, and the river Lethe. The Gorgias develops the judges of the dead, with a particular attention to how the evaluation of souls actually works, what it is that the judges look at, what evidence they examine, how the truth of a soul's character is legible to those with the clarity to read it. Together, the three dialogues form what might be called the first sustained attempt to turn the underworld from a place of vivid images into a place with a coherent administrative structure, a place not just of depth and darkness and the presence of the dead, but of roads that go somewhere, regions with specific functions, judges with specific roles, and a process that has been working the same way since the first soul arrived. There is something characteristic of Plato in this, the desire to understand not just that the world is arranged in a certain way, but why it is arranged that way, what the arrangement expresses, what it would mean if the cosmos were organized with the thoroughness and the moral clarity that his dialogues consistently argue it is. The underworld of Hesiod in Homer is cosmologically given. It is there because the world has depth, because the dead have to go somewhere, because the darkness below the earth is as old as anything. The underworld of Plato is cosmologically argued. It is there because souls require a certain kind of sorting after death, because justice requires a geography in which virtue and wickedness lead to different destinations, because the cosmos is a place in which the moral character of a life leaves traces that cannot be hidden, and that the right judges can read with perfect clarity. Neither account cancels the other. The older images remain, the anvil falling through 9 days of dark, the Cimmerian shore where the sun never reached, Erebus where the last light dissolved, the three brothers at the moment of the cosmic lottery. Plato added a structure to the darkness, a set of roads through the terrain that Hesiod had located and Homer had approached. And the result by the 4th century BCE was a mythology of the underworld that had both depth and organization, a place with the age and the scale of Hesiod's cosmological account, and the internal coherence of Plato's philosophical mapping. The underworld that these traditions accumulated over several centuries of telling and retelling and thinking was not a single consistent place. It changed as the traditions changed, gained detail and structure as different thinkers and poets and traditions added their portions of the map. What it retained across those changes was the fundamental fact of its location, below, further below than anything, below even the ordinary below, at the distance of 9 days of falling through unbroken dark. That fact had been established early and was not revised. Whatever the underworld contained, whatever regions and rivers and roads and souls, it was always located in that place, at that depth, in the specific dark that began in Erebus and continued downward. The oldest account, the Theogony's account, gives the underworld its location, its depth, and its connection to the genealogy of divine beings who were themselves born from chaos. Oedipus, the first dark, was among the earliest things to exist, born alongside night, from the first gap in the cosmos. The underworld that took Erebus's name for its uppermost region was therefore not a constructed place in the way that a palace or a city is constructed. It was more like a feature of the world's deep structure, something that had been there in some form since before the first gods were born, since before the Titans, since before the division of the cosmos among the three brothers. The darkness at the bottom of the world was older than the gods who governed it, and then Hades received his portion in the lottery that settled the shape of the cosmos after the Titanomachy, and the realm that had existed since before the gods had a name became his. He moved into it. He governed it. He brought to it whatever a god brings when he makes a place his own, his presence, his order, his particular divine character. And the darkness that had been there since the beginning of everything became, in the tradition, inseparable from him. In ancient Greek, the word Hades referred to two things that were, in practice, not really two things at all. It was the name of the god, the third brother, the one who had drawn the lot that sent him downward, the ruler of the realm of the dead, and it was the name of the place, the underworld itself, the entire subterranean world, with all its rivers and roads and regions and the souls of all the dead since the beginning of human time. The god and the place shared a name. In other traditions, divine rulers and their domains were understood as related but distinct. The god was one thing, the kingdom was another. In the Greek tradition, at least in the case of this particular god and this particular realm, the language had not kept them separate. The name Hades, as a place, appears in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey with the same ease and frequency as the name of any other geographic location. The dead go to Hades. A soul descends to Hades. Hermes leads shades down to Hades. The word functions as a place name, a destination, a location on the map of the cosmos, and it is the same word as the name of the god who lives there, rules there, never leaves there. Whether ancient speakers always registered both meanings simultaneously is impossible to know, but the fact that the language offered no distinction between them, that the same word served for both the ruler and his realm, with no suffix or modifier needed to clarify which was meant, suggests something about how the Greeks understood the relationship between the two. Hades was not a god who happened to rule the underworld the way a king rules a territory that existed before him and will exist after him. Hades and the underworld were, in the language the tradition used, the same thing. The realm was the expression of the god. The god was the embodiment of the realm. Whatever made the underworld what it was, its depth, its darkness, its absolute and irrevocable separation from the living world, its quality of permanence, of stability, of a place that received everything and released nothing, all of that was also the nature of the god. And the word for one was the word for the other. The bronze anvil that falls through 9 days and nights of darkness before it strikes the floor of the world is not described in Hesiod's Theogony as falling toward a god. It falls toward a place. But the place has the name it has because a god received it in a lottery, and that god stayed in it, and the god and the place grew so completely identical that the language of the tradition found it unnecessary to distinguish them. The realm presses downward beneath everything, beneath the earth where mortals walk, beneath the sea that Poseidon governs, beneath the sky where Zeus holds his portion of the divided cosmos. Its darkness is the oldest darkness, born from chaos alongside night, before the gods of the Olympian generation existed. Its distance from the surface of the world is the specific distance of 9 days and 9 nights of continuous falling through dark. Its entrance is at the world's edge, where the mist stays and the sun has never reached, and black poplars grow beside still water. and its name, in the language of the tradition, is a single word that means the ruler and the realm at once, a quiet linguistic fact that settles like the last detail of a very old map, the final mark that makes the whole thing feel complete. The Styx completes its ninth circuit in absolute darkness, the current bending for the last time through a place where no light has ever been, and then the river tips downward and drops not violently, but with the slow, inevitable weight of water that has been moving in the same direction since before the gods were named, into Tartarus far below, its sound diminishing until there is nothing left of it but the faint memory of moving water, and then nothing at all. The Styx is the oldest of the underworld's rivers. In the tradition that Hesiod set down in the Theogony, it flows 9 full times around the interior of the underworld before reaching that final descent, 9 complete circuits through a darkness so thorough and so total that the river's own surface cannot be seen, except in those places where it catches, somehow, the distant cold light that filters down from above. 9 is not a casual number in this tradition. It mirrors the 9 days a bronze anvil would fall from heaven before striking the floor of the underworld, which is how the oldest sources measured the distance between worlds, in days of falling, in repetitions of darkness, in numbers that communicated vastness without needing to name it directly. The Styx does not wind through the underworld the way a surface river winds through a valley. It encompasses, it goes around. Its 9 circuits mean that almost anywhere a soul traveled in the interior of the realm, the Styx was somewhere nearby, audible perhaps, through the stillness, a slow and certain current moving in the dark. What made the Styx remarkable was not only its length and its course, but the particular quality of its water. In the tradition, the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths by the Styx. This was not a matter of convention or ceremony alone, it was a structural feature of the cosmos. God who swore by the Styx and violated that oath suffered consequences that even immortality could not deflect. Hesiod describes such a god as lying for a full great year without breath, unable to touch ambrosia or nectar, lying in a trance that was not quite sleep and not quite death, but something between, and then for 9 further years excluded from the councils of the Olympians and their feasts. The water of the Styx carried the specific gravity of a vow that could not be undone. Even the gods felt its weight. This made it unlike any other substance in the underworld or above it, a river whose waters were not nourishing, but binding, not drinkable, but contractual, not a flow so much as a guarantee, moving endlessly through the dark, in 9 slow circuits around a world that it, in some sense, held together. A traveler in the underworld, who knew the tradition, would understand that the sound of the Styx, wherever it came from in the surrounding darkness, was the sound of the word of the gods made permanent. There is something to sit with in that image, a river as the physical form of an unbreakable promise, flowing through the underworld, not toward any sea, but simply around, and around, and around again, as if the act of encircling were itself a kind of oath, the river holding the whole interior of the realm, the way a vow holds 2 parties to what they have agreed. The river known as the Acheron occupied a different position in the tradition, both geographically and functionally. Where the Styx moved at the underworld's periphery in its slow 9 circuits, the Acheron served as the primary crossing river, the waterway that souls encountered on arrival, the one that separated the world of the living from the world of the dead in the most immediate and practical sense. In Plato's account in the Phaedo, the Acheron is described in some detail, a great river moving through the underworld's landscape, broad and purposeful, carrying souls the way rivers carry what is placed on them, gathering the newly dead from the banks where they waited and moving them steadily toward the place they were meant to go. Its name in Greek can be read as carrying the sense of woe, not sharp grief, not anguish, but the particular quality of sorrowfulness that attaches to permanent things, to separations that are final, to the understanding that the far bank is a different country from the near one, and that the crossing goes only one way. The river that bore this name in the living world was real. It flows still through the region of Epirus in northwestern Greece, moving through limestone ravines and darkening as it passes through the particular geology of that landscape, a river with a quality of shadow to it, even in full daylight, its water cold and clear, but somehow drawing the eye downward rather than across. Near the ancient confluence of the Acheron and the Cocytus rivers, where the land flattened into marshland and the air carried the particular stillness of a place between the water and the rock, there was an ancient oracle of the dead, a necromantion, in Greek a place where the living could consult the spirits of the departed. Ancient visitors descended through stone corridors cut into the earth, moving downward in the dark, the sound of water audible through the stone walls, until they reached a chamber deep below the surface, where the boundary between the living and the dead world felt to them genuinely thin. The landscape outside, the dark water in the ravine below, the limestone walls rising on each side, the particular absence of birdsong that the geography produced, was exactly the kind of landscape where an ancient Greek traveler would already begin to feel that the world above and the world below were not as separate as they had seemed. The mythological Acheron and the real Acheron existed in the same tradition, neither one simply a copy of the other. The Greeks who built the oracle near the river's banks were working with a landscape that already looked to them like what the poets described. The dark water, the narrow gorge, the way the river's source seemed to emerge from underground as if it had been somewhere else entirely before arriving in this world. All of this meant that the real river and the mythological one confirmed each other, each making the other more fully true. In the Phaedo, the Acheron flows into a great lake, the Acherusian Lake, a wide and still body of water where souls disembarked after their crossing and settled into rest or further passage, depending on the character of what they had carried with them from life. The lake is described as a place of some patience. It is not a way station to be passed through quickly. Some souls stayed on its shores for a long time, working through what needed to be worked through before their passage could continue. The Acheron itself, arriving into this space, would slow and widen the way rivers do when they approach a body of standing water, their urgency releasing into something broader and calmer and less directed. Across the underworld's interior, the phlegethon moved in a different register entirely. Its name comes from the Greek verb meaning to burn, and this naming was accurate in the specific sense that the phlegethon was a river of fire, not of water at all. Though it moved through the underworld's geography as rivers move, coursing through the dark in what Plato's Phaedo describes as a circle running opposite the Acheron. The tradition is careful about what kind of fire this was. It did not give warmth. It did not give light in any sense that would illuminate the surrounding darkness in a useful way. It simply burned in the dark, moving through its course with the same patient inevitability that the other rivers moved through theirs, a current of fire in a world of rock and shadow, the flames burning cold, or burning in a way that the word cold does not quite capture, but that no other word serves better. There is something genuinely unusual about a fire described this way, stripped of the two qualities that fire most essentially has when it appears in the living world. What remains is fire as a pure phenomenon, fire as a property of moving things, fire as the form of a river that happens not to be water. The phlegethon also served a function in the larger geography. Plato describes it as encircling Tartarus in its circuit, so that the deepest and most sealed region of the underworld was surrounded not by walls of rock alone, but by this ongoing circuit of cold flame, a boundary that announced itself through the quality of light it cast, orange and distant and slightly wavering, without illuminating anything clearly. A traveler in the outer underworld would know, from this glow visible somewhere in the deeper distance, where Tartarus began without needing to approach any closer. The phlegethon was in this sense also a kind of boundary marker, the fire doing what the walls could not, making visible the fact that beyond a certain point the landscape changed in a way that was different in kind from the difference between other regions. The Cocytus, the fourth of the named rivers, carried in its name the sound of lamentation. The Greek verb from which it derives was used for the specific cry of grief, not weeping exactly, but the vocal expression of sorrow that goes past words, the sound a person makes when the thing they are mourning is fully real to them. A river named from this sound would not be a quiet river. Yet in Plato's account in the Phaedo, the Cocytus is described with a particular geographical function that gives it a strange kind of quietness despite its name. It carried souls who had committed serious wrongs in their lives, wrongs serious enough to require a long accounting, but not so serious that their passage was permanently foreclosed, to the shores of the Acherusian lake, where they called out across the water to those they had wronged in life, asking for forgiveness, waiting for a response that might come or might not, the lake's width providing a distance that was both physical and moral, a space wide enough for the exchange that needed to happen. The souls on these shores were not frantic. The Phaedo is careful about the register. They called out. They waited. If the person they had wronged offered forgiveness, the Cocytus bore the soul onward. If forgiveness was withheld, the river brought the soul back again, to circle and try again. This could take a long time. The Acherusian lake was patient. The river carrying its souls was patient. The waiting on those shores was not frantic or anguished in the way the river's name might suggest. It was more like the particular kind of waiting that comes when a person knows exactly what they need, and knows that it might come eventually, and knows there is nothing to do but remain, and call out across the water and wait for the answer. There is something worth dwelling on in the detail that the Cocytus required the participation of the living and the dead both. The soul on the Acherusian shore could not simply be forgiven by the judges or by the landscape itself. The forgiveness had to come from the person wronged. This made the Cocytus one of the more unusual features of the underworld's hydrology, a river whose function depended not only on the soul it was carrying, but on what was possible between souls who had once known each other in the world above, whose relationship had not been resolved before the dying happened, who now found themselves separated by a wide still lake in the interior of the realm of the dead, with only their voices to cross the water. What the Cocytus flows into eventually connects it to the larger circuit of the underworld's waters. The rivers of the underworld are not simply parallel lines running through the same dark ground. They interact, they converge, they empty into each other or into the lakes, and lakes empty into them, and the whole interior hydrological system moves in patterns that the sources describe, piecemeal, in different texts from different centuries, with the variations that come from a tradition building its understanding of a place over a long time without any single cartographer to reconcile all the accounts into a single map. but the impression that comes through across all of them is of genuine movement, water actually flowing, fire actually burning along its circuit. The underworld is a place with its own internal geography that was as real to the Greeks who described it as the rivers of the surface world. The Lethe was different from the others in a way that makes it worth considering on its own terms. For a moment, where the Styx was binding, and the Acheron was a crossing, and the Phlegethon was flame in the dark, and the Cocytus was lamentation working toward resolution, the Lethe was simply the river of forgetting. Its name meant forgetfulness. To drink from it was to lose everything a soul had carried, not punishment, not grief, not the weight of specific wrongs, but everything, the memories of a life, the memories of the afterlife that followed it, the whole accumulated content of an individual existence, dissolved in a single draught of cold, dark water. In Plato's myth of air, near the end of the Republic, the Lethe is described with considerable specificity. Air is a soldier from Pamphylia who died in battle and returned to life and reported what he had seen. On the plane of forgetfulness, after souls had chosen the lives they would next live, they were led to the Lethe to drink. The plain was arid and treeless. The river moved through it without shade. The souls were required to drink a certain measure, a specific fixed amount, though the tradition notes that the unwise drank more than they needed to, and only the very wise drank only as much as necessity required. What the extra drinking meant is left for the reader to feel rather than stated directly, the unwise arriving at their next lives, carrying less of themselves than they might have, the wise carrying just enough to be who they were. What exactly that minimum carried, whether it was anything the soul would feel consciously, or only some deeper residue of what the soul had become through its long history of choices, the tradition does not fully resolve. The Lethe running through the plain of forgetfulness is a river that has always carried this particular quality of stillness in the imagination. It is not dramatic. It does not crash through gorges or burn cold in the dark. It moves through an arid plain under an empty sky, and souls come to it and kneel at its edge and drink, and what they were before they drank recedes from them as the water's effect begins, quietly and completely and without any particular sound. There is something genuinely interesting about a river conceived this way, not as a feature of a landscape that impresses itself on the traveler by its power or its strangeness, but simply as a slow water running through dry ground, offering its forgetting freely to anyone who came to it, the way all rivers offer their water, without preference, without judgment, to whoever kneels at the bank. The Menabasine stood in a specific relation to the Lethe, and this is where the tradition arrives at something particularly worth sitting with. Mnemosyne, memory, was both a goddess and, in certain traditions connected to the Orphic mysteries, a spring or water source in the underworld, a counterpart to the Lethe in the same landscape. Souls who knew of it, and who were wise or initiated into the relevant understanding, were instructed to drink from Mnemosyne rather than from the Lethe. To drink from memory, rather than forgetting, was to retain what had been learned across the long cycle of lives, to carry the accumulated self forward, rather than releasing it entirely at the threshold of the next existence. The gold tablets found in ancient Greek burial sites across southern Italy and Greece, thin sheets of hammered gold inscribed with instructions for the soul's navigation of the underworld, carry this prescription in various forms. The soul is instructed where to find the spring, which guardians might be present, what to say, which water to drink. Some tablets begin with the instruction, "Do not go near the spring of Lethe." Others direct the soul more positively toward Mnemosyne. The tablets are small, light things. They were rolled or folded and placed in the mouth or on the chest of the dead, sent with the body as the most practical provision possible for the journey that the tradition held was coming. What the Orphic tradition described was a specific geography in which these two water sources coexisted in the same underworld landscape, forgetfulness and memory as parallel springs, one the default approach for the unprepared soul, one accessible to those who knew to look for it. This placed a real structural opposition at the heart of the underworld's interior, not between reward and punishment, not between the living and the dead, but between two ways of moving through time, two ways of carrying or releasing what had been accumulated through a lifetime and an afterlife, and the slow, vast circuit of return. Two springs in the same landscape, forgetfulness and memory running side by side through the same dark ground, offering their different waters to souls who arrived at this place with all their earthly qualities stripped away, wealth and beauty and status already dissolved, only the shape the soul itself had taken over the course of its life, remaining visible, moving through an interior landscape of rivers and plains and lakes toward one water or the other. The rivers of the underworld, taken together, form a kind of interior system, each one named, each one functionally distinct, each one moving through the same dark geography in a different way toward a different end. The Styx in its 9 circuits binding the whole interior together with the weight of the god's own oaths. The Acheron carrying souls across the boundary between the world above and the world below, broad and slow and purposeful, the Phlegethon running its circuit of cold flame around the deepest sealed place in the underworld, its glow visible from a distance in the dark, the Cocytus carrying the lamentation of souls who had serious accounting to do, bringing them to the shores of the wide lake where forgiveness might still be asked for and given, and the Lethe moving through its arid plain in the underworld's interior, offering forgetfulness to souls preparing to return, its current slow and shallow and quiet in a landscape that asked nothing of the soul except that it come, eventually, to the edge of the water and drink. The tradition does not describe anyone walking the full length of all 5 rivers. That would be a very long walk in the dark. But the rivers were all there, all moving, all named, all understood as features of a geography as real as any the living world contained, each one reflecting something about what the tradition understood, death and passage and return to mean. The underworld had its own hydrological system, as the surface world had the great rivers of Greece and Asia and Egypt and the Mediterranean that the Greeks knew from travel and trade and the reports of sailors. Below those surface rivers, in the tradition's understanding, these other rivers moved in their parallel and darker courses, following their own courses through the rock and the darkness, finding their ways to the lakes and the depths and the circuits they had always followed. On the surface of the earth, in the place where the actual Acheron ran through its limestone ravine in Ibris, the water moved as it always had, dark, cold, clear, where the sun reached it, shadowed where the cliffs rose on either side. Ancient visitors who came to the oracle near its banks would have stood on those shores in the early morning, with the mist still on the water, and felt in that particular landscape the truth of what the poets had described, not as metaphor, as geography, as the place where 2 worlds came closest to each other, where the water running under the ground and the water running over it were perhaps the same water moving in different registers of the same dark country. The Styx wound its 9 circuits through the underworld's interior, the sound of it audible everywhere and then nowhere, the river appearing out of the dark and disappearing back into it, going around and around the realm it had enclosed, since before any of the rivers above ground had been named. A god standing at the edge of its black water and speaking the words of an oath, swearing by the Styx, felt in that moment the full weight of what the river was. Not just water, not just a boundary, but the contractual structure of the cosmos itself, made liquid, made flowing, made into a current that would keep moving long after the oath and the god who swore it were both forgotten by the living world above. Both the Leth and the Menacine were present in the same underworld landscape, forgetfulness and memory, two springs, or rivers, or water sources. The sources differ in their precision, sitting near each other in the dim interior of the realm of the dead, their waters tasting, presumably, of the same cold darkness, indistinguishable to the eye, everything different in the choosing. What a soul carried forward into the next life, and what it released depended entirely on which of those two waters it found, and knelt beside, and drank from at that last moment before the cycle began again. Lake Avernus, at dawn, is perfectly still. The water holds no reflection of the sky, because the sky above it is the same color as the water below, a dark, undifferentiated gray that makes it difficult to say where the surface of the lake ends and the air above it begins. Thin columns of sulfurous vapor rise from the water in the early morning, curling upward through the cliffs that ring the lake on every side, and there are no birds. Ancient visitors noticed this first and remarked on it in their accounts. No bird crossed the lake, no bird nested in the dense vegetation of the surrounding cliffs. No call or wing beat disturbed the silence above the water. The Latin name Avernus was understood by ancient Romans to mean exactly this, without birds, a lake so suffused with volcanic exhalation that nothing living chose to pass over it, and a silence so complete that it required no explanation other than the obvious one, which was that this was the kind of place where the world's edge was very close. The volcanic region of Campania in southern Italy held this lake at its center, in an ancient caldera now filled with dark water, its rim forested, its surface unmarked by current or wave. Virgil, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, placed the entrance to the underworld here, not because he invented the association, but because it already existed. The landscape had been understood for centuries as the kind of terrain where the living world thinned out and something else began. The vapors that rose from its surface in the morning were real vapors, sulfurous and warm, evidence of the volcanic activity still working slowly beneath the region's stone floor. The cliffs that kept the birds away were real cliffs. The quality of the light over the water at certain hours was genuinely unusual, flat and directionless, and without the warmth that characterized ordinary daylight in that latitude. A traveler arriving at Lake Avernus in the early morning, not knowing what it was, would have known immediately what kind of place it was. The landscape did not require interpretation, it interpreted itself. Virgil's 6th book of the Aeneid brings Aeneas to this shore in the company of the Sibyl of Cumae, a prophetess whose sanctuary lay near the lake's edge. The Sibyl had guided many toward this point, and she knew the approach well. The particular stillness of the water, the way the surrounding forest pressed close without sound, the cave in the cliffside through which the path descended. Ancient accounts describe a yawning opening in the volcanic stone, wide enough for several people to pass abreast, from which a cold exhalation rose even on warm days, the breath of the deep coming upward through the rock to meet whatever air pressed down from above. This was the mouth of the entrance, not a constructed gate, not an architectural threshold, but a feature of the landscape itself, a gap in the surface of the world where the world simply stopped going sideways and began going down. The descent from the lake's edge into the earth was not steep in the way a cliff is steep. It was the particular gradient of a path that has been walked enough times to settle into the stone, the kind of slope that asks nothing dramatic from the person descending it, but that makes it clear, with every step, that above is receding and below is approaching. The light from the entrance diminished with a specific regularity, not all at once, not in sharp increments, but in the way light diminishes when the source of it is falling behind, and every step places more stone between the traveler and the sky. What remained at the bottom of this diminishment was not darkness in the complete sense. It was a threshold kind of illumination, enough to perceive shape and distance, not enough to read color or determine expression. The ancient sources describe this as the light of the underworld proper, and it had its own quality, not the gray of overcast days above ground, not the orange of firelight, but something that carried no association with any light source the living world contained. All meant at some point along this descent, the path leveled, and at the level place there was water. The river was the first boundary, the first feature of the realm that required something of those arriving. It was not narrow. Ancient accounts describing the crossing vary in what they emphasize, but they agree that the river was broad enough that the far shore was visible only as a dim suggestion of land in the underworld's ambient light, and that the water moved slowly but with the purposeful movement of a current that knew where it was going. The near shore was populated, not crowded in the way a market is crowded, not pressed together in panic or urgency, but occupied in the way a harbor is occupied while people wait for a vessel to depart. Figures stood or sat at the edge of the water. Some had been there a long time, others had arrived recently. All of them were waiting for the same thing. Charon was already there. He is described in Virgil's account with the particular attention given to someone who has been doing the same work for so long that the work has become indistinguishable from the person doing it. His beard was white and unkempt, not neglected, but simply unattended, the beard of someone to whom such things had long since stopped mattering. His eyes, Virgil writes, were like burning coals, which in the underworld's dim light would have made him visible at a distance, two fixed points of orange brightness moving across the dark water as his boat made its crossings. His robe was knotted roughly at one shoulder, practical in the way of clothing worn only for labor, leaving one arm free to work the long pole he used to push the flat-bottomed vessel through the shallows near each shore. He was old, but old in the manner of something ancient that does not decay, vigorous in the particular way of a being for whom age had become permanent rather than progressive, whose white beard and burning eyes would look exactly the same 10,000 years from now as they had 10,000 years ago. His boat was not the kind of vessel built for open water. It was flat-bottomed, low-sided, built for the specific conditions of shallow dark rivers rather than for any kind of sea. In the shallows near either shore, Charon used the pole, pushing off from the riverbed with a practiced efficiency that required almost no visible effort, the vessel responding immediately and moving out into the deeper current, where the pole was lifted clear of the water and laid across the gunwales, and the current carried the boat forward on its own. In the deeper channel, he waited, watching the far shore resolve out of the dimness as the crossing progressed, then took up the pole again for the final approach to the landing. This sequence, push, drift, push, land, had repeated itself more times than could be counted. It was still repeating now. It would continue repeating. The crossing was not a dramatic event for Charon. It was simply what the river required of him, and he met that requirement without ceremony. The obol that the dead carried for this crossing was the smallest denomination of ancient Greek currency. In weight and size it was almost nothing, a thin disk of bronze or silver, worn smooth from handling, the image on its face reduced by circulation to a suggestion of features rather than a clear portrait. What mattered about it was not its value in any economic sense. What mattered was that it was the thing that allowed the crossing to proceed. Families understood this. In burials across the Greek and Roman world, stretching across several centuries and many different regional practices, coins have been found in and near the mouths of the dead, placed there by a family member in the last moments before burial, sometimes beneath the tongue, sometimes resting on the closed eyes, sometimes simply pressed into the hand. The gesture was entirely practical. Whatever one thought about what came after death, whatever uncertainty attended the specific geography of what lay beyond the living world, this much was agreed upon: the dead would need the coin, and providing it was the last useful thing the living could do for them. The weight of this custom falls not on the dead, but on the living. To send a family member into the ground with the coin was to take seriously the specific material requirements of a specific place. It was to treat the underworld's geography as genuinely real, as a landscape with its own economy, its own procedures, its own figure waiting on the water with a flat-bottomed boat who would need to be paid before he would move the pole. The small, worn under an almost weightless disk of bronze or silver, was the expression of a belief that the world the dead entered was not vague or metaphorical. It was organized, it had rules, and those rules could be met or failed to meet, and meeting them was the family's responsibility as much as the deceased's. What happened when those rules were not met is described with a particular clarity in the ancient sources. Souls who had not received proper burial rites, whose bodies had been left unburied, exposed, denied the rituals that the living owed to the dead, could not cross. Charon would not take them. They were turned away from the boat and left on the near shore, the shore belonging fully to neither the living world nor the world of the dead, a margin of the underworld populated by figures in suspension. They could see the far shore. They knew exactly what lay across the water and exactly how to reach it. The only thing between them and that crossing was the requirement they had not been able to fulfill through no fault of their own: no body, no burial, no coin, no family member to perform the rites. And the ancient tradition holds that these souls waited 100 years before Charon would carry them across without payment. 100 years is a long time when measured against a human life, but it is a very specific quantity when measured against what comes after, the eternity of the underworld's interior, the permanent residence in whatever region a soul was eventually assigned. Against that scale, 100 years of waiting on the near shore was a finite inconvenience, precisely bounded, guaranteed eventually to end. The near shore was not a place of active suffering. Ancient accounts do not describe it as painful or distressing in the way that certain other regions of the underworld were painful or distressing. It was a margin, a holding area, a place populated by figures who were doing nothing except existing in time and waiting for time to do what time eventually does, which is pass. There is something in this arrangement that the Greeks found worth preserving across many generations of telling. The obligation to bury the dead was one of the most serious moral duties in ancient Greek life, and this tradition was part of why not only sentiment, not only respect for the body, but the specific understanding that without proper burial, the dead person would be stranded at that margin, visible from the far shore, but unable to reach it, waiting in suspension for a century, while those who had failed the obligation went about their living. This framing placed the burden exactly where the tradition believed it belonged, on the living, whose responsibility it was to see the dead properly across. Charon moved his boat across the water in both directions. He brought the dead from the near shore to the far shore. He returned empty across the current, or with the occasional rare figure making the journey the other way. The mythological exceptions, the mortals who had found ways past the ordinary rules governing who could cross. These crossings in the unusual direction, from the far shore back toward the near shore and the living world, were different in character from the ordinary crossings that made up the overwhelming majority of Charon's work. They required something beyond the obol. They required objects of extraordinary power or gifts of extraordinary quality, and even with those, Charon's willingness was not certain. He had been persuaded. Occasionally, he had not been fooled. The distinction matters. The ferryman of the dead was not deceived into permitting the exceptional crossings that myth records. He was moved by them, which is a different thing entirely. Past the river, past Charon's landing on the far shore, the path into the underworld's interior passed through a threshold guarded by Charon's counterpart at the inner boundary. The figure who ensured that arrivals who had been permitted to cross could not simply turn around and return the way they had come. Cerberus is his name in the Greek tradition, and the accounts of him vary in their details in a way that is worth holding for a moment. Hesiod, writing in the 7th or 8th century before the Common Era, describes him with 50 heads, a serpent for a tail, and snakes bristling from his back in a dense covering. Later accounts settled on 3 heads as the standard count, though the serpentine qualities persisted in many of them. What does not vary across the accounts is his function, which was not to threaten arrivals, but to prevent departures. This is the detail that changes everything about how Cerberus sits in the imagination. He was not a predator at the entrance to the underworld, stationed there to menace the souls arriving from the near shore. He was a gatekeeper oriented toward the interior, his attention directed not at those coming in, but at those who might try to leave. Arrivals were welcomed. New shades approaching the threshold after crossing were greeted in the manner of anyone whose arrival was expected and whose presence was not a problem. The tail moved, the many heads oriented toward the newcomer. This was not a creature in a state of threat. This was a creature in a state of recognition, noting the arrival, registering it, allowing it to proceed. What Cerberus prevented was the movement of souls back across the threshold toward the living world, and in this function he was almost entirely successful. The mythological tradition records 4 exceptions, 4 figures who passed Cerberus in the outward direction, from the underworld's interior back toward the entrance. Orpheus, the musician whose lyre playing moved even stones and rivers in the living world, played for Cerberus and was permitted to pass. Heracles, arriving on one of his labors, subdued the dog by force. The accounts differ on whether he used a choking hold or simply overwhelmed the creature by strength, but the result was the same, a temporary yielding. Aeneas, in Virgil's account, came bearing the golden bow, whose properties in relation to the underworld's rules are described as specific and unconditional. Whatever the bow was, its presence meant that the ordinary prohibitions did not apply, and Psyche, in Apuleius's later account, carried a honey cake, a specific preparation understood to neutralize Cerberus's guardianship long enough for passage. 4 exceptions across the entire span of the mythological tradition. The rules governing Cerberus's function were not regularly circumvented. They were not a flimsy barrier easily overcome by any sufficiently determined mortal. They were the rules of the underworld itself, and they held because the underworld was a place that held a stable system, a realm with its own coherent logic, administered by figures who carried out their functions without exception and with the particular reliability of things that have never needed to be otherwise. Orpheus is worth staying with for a moment, not because his story belongs to this threshold in its entirety, but because the moment of Cerberus and the lyre is one of the tradition's most carefully rendered images of what the underworld's rules actually permitted. Orpheus did not trick Cerberus. He did not deceive or subdue or drug the creature. He played, and the playing was enough. This suggests something specific about what Cerberus was, not a mechanical barrier responding only to force or proper credentials, but a being capable of being moved by music, which means a being with something that functioned like response, like attention, like the capacity to be affected by beauty. The underworld's guardian at the inner threshold was not an automaton. He was something old and strange, operating by rules that were mostly absolute and occasionally susceptible to the extraordinary. The boat that brought souls to the far shore touched a bank that was not the same as any bank of any river in the living world. Its texture was different. Fine dark sand, or bare stone, or the kind of soft ground that holds the shape of a footprint without the moisture that would ordinarily account for it. Whatever the surface, the landing was specific, and the path from the landing into the underworld's interior was clear. Not perfectly lit, but visible. The ancient accounts of descents to the underworld tend to agree on this quality of the underworld's light. It was not darkness in the complete sense, not the impenetrable black of a sealed room, but a permanent ambient dimness that permitted navigation without permitting the particular quality of sight that the living world's light enabled. Colors were subdued, distances were readable, the landscape was perceivable. It simply did not receive light in the way the surface received it, and everything perceived within it had the slightly flattened quality of objects seen without strong shadow or direct illumination. The path from Charon's landing toward the underworld's interior was not unmarked. The tradition holds that the underworld was organized as a place, not as a void, that it had geography, internal structure, regions with specific names and specific characters, and that movement through it was movement along particular routes toward particular places. The path from the landing followed the course of the river for a distance before bending inland, and those who followed it were following a route that countless shades had followed before them, in the same direction, at whatever pace the tradition imagined the dead to move, which was neither hurried nor sluggish, but steady, the pace of someone who knows the destination and is moving toward it with the calm of a figure for whom urgency has become unnecessary. Cerberus's position on this path was at the point where the path entered the underworld's interior properly, past the influence of the entrance, past the residual qualities of the world above that might still be faintly detectable near the crossing. He stood where the underworld became entirely itself, where nothing above ground had any further bearing on anything, and where the rules of the realm applied completely and without exception. Shades arriving at this point were already beyond the living world in every sense that mattered. They had crossed the river, they had paid the ferryman, or waited the 100 years. They had entered the territory of the dead. Cerberus at the inner threshold was not a final obstacle between the dead and their destination. He was the confirmation that they had arrived. The particular quality of his welcome is something the tradition returns to in different contexts and different accounts, with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely important to the ancient imagination. The creature with 50 heads in Hesiod, the creature with 3 heads in the more settled later accounts, the creature with serpent tail and snake-covered back, this creature, in whatever form, greeted the arriving dead without menace. The many mouths were oriented away from arrivals toward the path back to the living world, toward the direction from which trouble would come, if trouble came at all. The arriving dead, turning from the boat landing toward the interior, would have found themselves moving past a guardian whose attention was directed elsewhere, not away from them, behind them, toward the crossing they had already completed, toward the world they had already left. There is a particular comfort in this arrangement that the tradition seems to have valued. The underworld's inner threshold was guarded, but it was guarded in a direction that posed no difficulty for those following the proper route, which was forward. The dead arriving through the ordinary means had nothing at the threshold to fear. The threshold was for them a passage, not a test. Whatever came next, the judgment, the sorting, the eventual arrival at whatever region corresponded to the kind of life each shade had lived that lay ahead in the interior. The threshold was simply the place where the underworld became final, and Cerberus was the figure who confirmed that finality, not with menace, but with the simple fact of his presence facing the other way. In this sense, Cerberus and Charon occupied symmetrical positions at the two boundaries of the crossing. Charon at the near shore faced toward the dead arriving from the living world, received their obol, carried them across. Cerberus at the inner threshold faced away from the arriving dead toward the living world, ensuring that what had been crossed could not be uncrossed. Between these two figures, the crossing from the living world to the dead one was enclosed. Nothing that belonged on one side would end up on the other by accident or without the extraordinary intervention the tradition carefully specified. The system was not cruel. It was not designed to harm. It was designed to hold, to maintain the boundary between the living world and the dead one in both directions, to ensure that the underworld remained what it was supposed to be, which was the place where the dead went and where they stayed. The volcanic landscape at the entrance, the still lake, the vapors rising from the water at dawn, these features of the surface world above the underworld's mouth were not decorative. They were functional, in the sense that they announced to anyone arriving at them that a change was coming. The world was about to become different in a specific and permanent way. The birds did not cross the lake because something in the air above it told them not to. The sulfur vapors rose because the rock beneath the lake was still warm from whatever heat sources lay far below. The cliffs that ringed the water kept the air still and enclosed in a way that ordinary lake shores did not. These were the features of a threshold, not manufactured, not arranged by any divine will for the purpose of effect, but naturally occurring in a way that made them feel like the landscape's own acknowledgement that something important was happening here, at this point, at this particular shore. Ancient visitors came to Lake Avernus. They stood where Virgil placed the Sibyl's sanctuary, looking out over the dark water and the rising columns of vapor, and they would have felt what the landscape offered, that quality of stillness and sulphurous air and absent birdsong that made the place feel separated from the ordinary world by more than distance. Some of them came for ritual purposes, to conduct the consultations with the dead that certain oracular practices permitted. Some came as pilgrims, drawn to the association. Fem came as travelers who had heard that this was the entrance and wanted to see what an entrance to the underworld actually looked like. All of them would have found the landscape waiting for them in its same particular way, unchanged by their arrival, unchanged by their departure, the dark water still, and the vapors still rising, and the silence still complete, above the surface, where no bird had ever been willing to fly. The threshold persists in this form. The lake is still there. The volcanic region around it is still warm. The caldera that became the lake is still a caldera, its walls still forested, its water still dark and still. The entrance that Virgil placed here, that earlier traditions had located in this landscape before Virgil formalized it, is not closed. The tradition does not describe it as having been closed. But the path from the near shore to the deep interior of the underworld, still proceeds in the direction it always proceeded, following whatever route Virgil's Sibyl knew, bending past whatever landmarks the dim light of the underworld's interior made navigable, arriving eventually at Charon's landing on the far side of the crossing river, and somewhere on the dark bank beyond the crossing, in the dim light that characterizes the underworld's interior, the figure of Cerberus remains oriented toward the path that leads back to the living world, his many heads and serpent tail unchanged by any passage of time, his tail moving slowly back and forth as another shade comes in from the direction of the river landing, arriving at the inner threshold with the forward momentum of a figure who has crossed already and is simply continuing to walk. The heads turn, the tail keeps moving, the arrival is noted, as every arrival is noted, without alarm and without ceremony. The shade passes through the threshold and into the interior of the underworld, and Cerberus returns his full attention to the path behind them, watching the direction from which the next exceptional figure might eventually come, the one rare and extraordinary arrival who will require something of him beyond the ordinary welcome he gives to all the rest. The lake above is still dark. The vapors are still rising. The silence above the water, in the earliest gray of morning, is still complete. Asphodel grew on the dry hillsides of ancient Greece, pale-stemmed, waist-high, with narrow leaves and flowers that opened in loose clusters along a single upright stalk. The blossoms were not white exactly, but a kind of washed-out ivory, almost gray in certain lights, and the plants favored rocky ground where little else would grow. The thin soil of exposed slopes and the margins of fields where the earth had given up trying to be fertile. Any Greek farmer walking home at dusk through a stretch of asphodel would have known the plant immediately, known its name, known what it meant. It was not an unusual or exotic flower. It was simply the flower that grew where the ground was poor and the light was thin, the flower of places that had been worn down to their bones. And so when the poets reached for an image to describe the floor of the underworld, the broad, neutral, endlessly extending plain where the majority of the dead came to rest, it was asphodel they chose. Not because the image was symbolic in any elaborate way, because any Greek who heard the word could picture it at once, that particular gray ivory color, that particular quality of thin light, that particular stretch of ground where the soil has nothing left to give. The asphodel meadows extended, in the tradition's accounting, without clear boundary in any direction. The flowers grew thickly across the gray ground, their stalks pale against a sky, if sky it could be called, that held no particular color, neither bright nor dark, simply the condition of a place from which strong light had been absent so long that its absence had become the natural order. The air in the meadows was neither warm nor cold. There was no wind and no stillness, or rather there was a kind of stillness so complete that it could not be distinguished from a wind that had stopped only a moment ago. The shades of ordinary people moved through the asphodel in something very close to silence, not because they were forbidden to speak, but because there was very little that needed saying, and whatever urgency speech had carried in the living world had dissolved with the crossing. Homer describes these shades in the Odyssey as fluttering. The Greek word is closer to that than to walking, with a quality of motion that suggested not purpose, but drift, not direction, but a slow general movement that carried them through the flowers without apparent destination and without apparent distress. The meadows were not a place of suffering. They were a place that was simply there, that had always been there, that asked nothing of the dead and gave them in return a kind of residence that was not quite rest and not quite waking, but somewhere between. Memory was the particular thing the meadows lacked, or rather the shades possessed it, only in the dimmest way, a kind of residue of a life rather than the life itself. Homer's Achilles, encountered in the underworld by Odysseus, is recognizably himself. He speaks, he has preferences, he asks after his father and his son with what appears to be genuine care. But this is partly because Odysseus has given him blood to drink, which restored for a moment the full weight of a living consciousness. Without that, Achilles would have been like the others, moving among the flowers in the condition of someone who can sense that they once had a life without being able to fully locate it. The meadows were not a punishment for those who lived badly. They were simply where the ordinary dead went, the vast middle space of the underworld, and the tradition held that their population was by far the largest. The extraordinary dead, the very virtuous, the very wicked went elsewhere, but for everyone in between, which was nearly everyone, there were the pale flowers and the still air and the long, unhurried, directionless residence of the asphodel plain. What the tradition offered to the virtuous dead was something substantially different, and the difference was above all a matter of light. Elysium, the Elysian Fields, the blessed plain, called by various names across the sources, was described consistently as a place where the sun shone steadily, where meadows stretched under clear air, where shade trees stood at intervals, and music moved through them on an afternoon that never progressed toward evening. Hesiod mentions it. Pindar describes it in considerable detail in his Olympian Odes. Plato returns to it across several dialogues. The accounts differ in particulars, but agree on the essential quality of the place, which was ease, not the ease of exhaustion or the ease of resignation, but the particular ease of a life from which the conditions that make difficulty possible have been quietly removed. There was no hunger in Elysium, no cold, no illness, no labor, no loss. The dead who resided there moved at whatever pace they chose, in whatever direction appealed to them, with no urgency pressing them anywhere. This was understood not as idleness, but as the natural condition of a life that no longer had anything it needed to accomplish, a life that could simply be itself without the pressure of necessity shaping every hour of it. Homer, in the Odyssey, places Elysium not inside the underworld at all, but at the ends of the earth, far to the west, under the rule of Rhadamanthus, beyond the reach of ordinary geography. The dead who went there did not need to cross the rivers or pass through the gray expanse of the asphodel plain. They simply arrived at a place the world had set aside for them, beyond ocean's edge, where the sun behaved differently and the air was its own kind of permanent afternoon. This early placement shifts somewhat across the tradition's development. Later sources, and Plato most systematically, incorporate Elysium into the underworld's interior as one of its distinct regions, but the quality of the place remained constant across the variation. It was the destination of those who had lived virtuously, and its defining feature was that the light never failed. Pindar's account in the Olympian Odes adds something specific to the texture of Elysium that the other sources do not quite provide, which is the quality of the air. Beyond the reach of sea winds, he says, which means the air there was simply still, not the stillness that precedes weather, but the settled, permanent stillness of a place that weather had agreed, a long time ago, to leave alone. In this still air, among meadows where golden flowers bloomed on trees, heavy with golden fruit, the virtuous dead spent their long residence in the company of their equals, people whose lives had been shaped by the same commitments, the same choices, the same willingness to do what was difficult when it needed doing. Rhadamanthus presided over this region, and there was in Pindar's description a sense that the community of the blessed was not solitary but social, that the ease of Elysium was the ease of a place where the people around you had also earned their way there, and where that fact was quietly understood by everyone without needing to be said. Beyond Elysium, further still in the tradition's geography, lay the Isle of the Blessed, a destination described by Pindar and by Plato as reserved for souls who had achieved Elysium across 3 separate lives. In the structure the tradition held, souls were reborn repeatedly, making choices in each life that accumulated in their nature, the way the grain accumulates in wood, and those souls who achieved virtue in one life, then in a second, then again in a third, had demonstrated something beyond ordinary goodness, a consistency of moral character across multiple existences, a quality of self that persisted through death and rebirth without losing its essential shape. These souls were not returned for a 4th life. They were sent instead to the Isle of the Blessed, which lay even beyond Elysium, even beyond the still air and the golden trees, at the furthest remove from the realm of ordinary mortal experience. Pindar describes it as a place of golden flowers and shade, of ease beyond ease, of a life so settled into its own perfection that even the language of happiness begins to seem too active a word for what the dead experienced there. Cronus himself ruled the island, the old Titan father of Zeus, serving in this late role of his long story as the ruler of the most peaceful place in the entire underworld geography. And the souls who reached the island had simply arrived somewhere they would not leave, in a stillness that asked nothing of them, for as long as anything in the underworld went on. The tradition did not restrict its map of the dead to those whose lives had been either ordinary or virtuous. Between the gray plain of the asphodel and the terrible depths of Tartarus lay a space that Virgil calls the morning fields in the asterisk Aeneid asterisk, in Latin the asterisk Lugentes Campi asterisk, and this region occupied a particular position in the underworld's moral geography that did not quite correspond to either virtue or wickedness. The shades who moved through the morning fields had been destroyed by love, not wicked love, not love as a vehicle for cruelty or selfish harm, but love in its most specifically ruinous form, love that consumed the person who felt it so completely that they lost themselves inside it, love that led through obsession or loss or grief or betrayal to a death that would not have come otherwise, love that left nothing behind but its own weight. These were not souls who had done wrong. They were souls who had been overwhelmed, who had run up against the particular kind of suffering that passion produces when it is met with nothing adequate to sustain it, and who carried that overwhelming into the underworld as the defining thing about them. The morning fields were a myrtle grove. This detail in Virgil is specific and carefully chosen because myrtle was in the ancient tradition the sacred plant of Aphrodite, the goddess associated with love and desire and the particular force that drove people toward each other and sometimes threw each other into ruin. The trees grew densely enough that moving among them required attention, required watching for branches at shoulder height and roots in the dim ground, required a slowness of pace that the region's gray light reinforced. The air between the myrtle trees was filtered by the canopy above into something softer than the already dim light of the underworld's interior, not dark, not bright, simply the muted quality of a place where the light arrived at multiple removes from any source that could be named. Among the branches moved the recognizable dead, those whose loves had been unrequited, those whose passions had led them through betrayal, those who had taken their own lives for reasons that could not be separated from what they had felt for another person. They moved without urgency, without apparent destination, in a condition that Virgil describes with considerable care as not quite grief and not quite peace. Both of those words imply a sharpness that the morning fields did not quite possess. What the shades there experienced was something more like the residue of grief, the way grief feels after it has been present for a very long time and has worn itself down to a quality of permanent awareness, a low, continuous knowing that something was lost and that the loss was real and that this now was the shape of things. Aeneas encounters Dido in the morning fields, and Virgil's account of this meeting is one of the most carefully measured passages in the entire asterisk. Aeneid asterisk. Dido, the Carthaginian queen, who loved Aeneas and was abandoned by him when duty called him toward Italy, and who killed herself in the aftermath of his departure, stands among the myrtle trees, a wound visible on her, and when Aeneas approaches her, she turns away. She does not speak. She moves toward a companion, another shade, and does not look back. Aeneas speaks to her at length, with genuine distress, insisting he did not leave willingly, that the gods compelled him, that he could not have chosen differently. She does not reply. She is not cruel in her silence. She is simply somewhere that speech can no longer reach her, somewhere that his particular words, his reasons, his regrets, his explanations have no more texture for her than the sound of any other thing moving among the myrtle. What had been between them was over in whatever way things in the underworld could be said to be over, and the morning fields were the place where that particular kind of over was kept. Aeneas weeps. The myrtle trees are still. He turns and follows his guide forward. Below everything that had been described so far, below the asphodel plain with its wandering shades, below the golden light of Elysium and the still air of the Isle of the Blessed, below the myrtle trees of the morning fields, lay Tartarus, and the tradition was consistent across its many sources in one particular. Tartarus was deep. Hesiod. In the asterisk theogony, asterisk gives the depth the same measurement he gives to the distance between the earth and the sky, as far below Hades as the sky is above the earth, the distance that a falling bronze anvil would traverse in 9 days and 9 nights, a span so vast that the number itself does more work than any description could. This was not hyperbole in the tradition's frame. It was a cosmological claim, a statement about the structure of everything, that the world was arranged in vertical layers of equal and enormous depth, sky and earth and Hades and Tartarus stacked at regular intervals, with the distance between each layer measuring the same incomprehensible span that the anvil traced in its long dark fall. Hesiod describes Tartarus as enclosed by triple walls of bronze and encircled by a river of fire, the Phlegethon, whose name came from a Greek root meaning to burn, and which ran in a circuit around Tartarus's perimeter in the deepest dark. The bronze walls were not symbolic. They were, in the tradition's geography, structural, the thing that separated the interior of Tartarus from the rest of the underworld's landscape as completely as walls could separate anything, containing inside them whatever was inside them with a permanence that nothing in the upper world possessed. Virgil, in the asterisk Aeneid asterisk, provides a traveler's perspective on Tartarus that is different from Hesiod's cosmological account, and the difference is illuminating. Aeneas does not enter Tartarus. His guide Sibyl explains clearly that she cannot enter, that no living person can, that even Aeneas traveling through the underworld alive, under the protection of the golden bough, cannot pass through those walls. What Aeneas perceives of Tartarus from outside is a matter of distance and sound. The Phlegethon's circuit of flame was visible from the approach, a moving orange glow In the deep dark below the level where Aeneas was walking, its light flickering against the underside of whatever the deep air held in the space between the river and the walls. The walls themselves, a tower rising above them as Virgil describes it, with an iron gate whose frame no mortal hand could have fitted together, were silhouetted at intervals against the phlegethon's glow, enormous and featureless, built for the single purpose of keeping inside what was inside, and from behind those walls, heard long before the walls themselves became visible, and heard still when the traveler had moved past them and begun to leave the region behind, came sound, not specific voices, not identifiable cries, but a continuous low texture of noise, chains, Virgil says, and something groaning, and something that arrives intermittently with the quality of impact, of something striking something. These sounds did not swell dramatically. They arrived at a consistent low volume, the way the sound of a distant city arrives to someone standing outside it, present enough to register, but without the sharpness that proximity would give. The walls were thick. They were 3 walls deep. Whatever was inside Tartarus was inside it completely, and the sounds that came through were what came through walls built to that specification, muffled, persistent, real, and belonging to a space that was not here, not anywhere that a traveler moving through the outer underworld was meant to be. The tradition held that Tartarus was the destination of those who had done wrong at a scale that went beyond ordinary wickedness into something more specifically cosmological, those who had offended the gods in ways that struck at the order of the world itself, those who had committed crimes against the living with such completeness of intent that no further reflection could be imagined to remedy what they had been. The Titans themselves, after their defeat by Zeus and the Olympians, had been cast into Tartarus, not imprisoned in any ordinary sense, but sent to the deepest available place in the structure of the cosmos, the place farthest from the light, farthest from the living world, as far down as it was possible to go. The bronze walls that enclosed them were the walls Hesiod describes, built by Poseidon and reinforced by the Phlegethon's constant circuit of fire. And certain named mortals, in various traditions, had joined them there, figures whose stories the tradition used to explore the consequences of specific kinds of transgression, each story shaped around a particular wrong and its particular permanent consequence. But the interior of Tartarus remained, for any traveler moving through the outer underworld, a matter of hearsay and distant sound. The walls held, the gate was shut. The phlegethon moved in its slow circuit around the perimeter, its glow visible from the path that led past and then away from the region, growing dimmer as the traveler moved back toward the more populated parts of the underworld, back toward the asphodel plain, back toward the myrtle grove, back toward the places where ordinary shades moved through their long, quiet residence in the company of others like themselves. What Tartarus contained, specifically, was something a traveler through the outer underworld was not positioned to know. What it contained, generally, was the thing that the walls were for, and the walls had been there long enough, in the tradition's accounting, that there was no reason to imagine they would stop working. There is a quality to the underworld's geography, considered from a sufficient distance, that is not easily expressed by any single one of its individual regions. The pale asphodel plain suggests one kind of afterlife. Elysium, under its steady afternoon light, suggests another entirely. The Isle of the Blessed, in its permanent still air, offers something different again. The morning fields with their myrtle trees describe a condition that neither of those earlier places accounts for. And Tartarus, with its bronze walls, and its muffled sounds, and its phlegethon running orange and low in the deep dark, marks the boundary of the whole system, the place past which the geography stops being something a traveler can move through and becomes instead something a traveler perceives from a safe distance and then walks away from. Together, these regions compose a world that is not a simple binary of reward and punishment, not a clean division of good people and bad, but something more detailed and more attentive to the actual variety of what human lives produce. The ordinary dead needed somewhere to rest. The virtuous dead needed somewhere they could be what virtue made them, without the conditions that made virtue difficult. Those destroyed by love needed a place that acknowledged that particular kind of destruction as its own category, distinct from wickedness, not deserving of the asphodel's blankness or the morning field's gray ease, but requiring its own landscape, its own trees, its own quality of air. The poets who shaped this geography were doing something that required considerable attention to what human experience was actually like. Hesiod, establishing the deepest structures of the cosmos, placed Tartarus at a depth that matched the sky's height, and meant it. Homer, wandering the asphodel plain with Odysseus, gave the ordinary dead their pale flowers and their dim condition, and did not apologize for how bleak that seemed. Because the blandness of the asphodel plain was the point, a world from which strong feeling has been removed is not violent or tormenting, but it is its own particular kind of diminishment, and that diminishment was what the tradition held in store for the vast majority of the dead. Pindar, writing for the victors of athletic games, men who had spent their lives developing excellence with the specific expectation that excellence meant something, described Elysium and the Isle of the Blessed as the logical destination of a life devoted to being genuinely good at what it did. And Virgil, standing inside a literary tradition that stretched back 7 centuries and more, chose to give Aeneas a route through the underworld that included a myrtle grove full of people who had loved badly, or been loved badly, or been loved badly, and to stage there one of the most restrained and painful encounters in the entire epic. Not a conflict, not a confrontation, simply a man speaking to a woman who has chosen not to hear him in a place built for exactly that silence. The asphodel flowers grew, in both the living world and the mythological one, in places that had been worn down to their essentials. There was something in that correspondence that the tradition held without needing to explain it. The idea that the flower of the worn-down earth was also the flower of the vast gray plain where the dead came to rest, that the landscape of the underworld's most populous region was simply the landscape of thin soil and poor light made into something permanent and enormously extended. Any ancient Greek who had walked through asphodel on a hillside above their village and looked out across a slope covered in those pale stalks, those gray ivory blooms in the thin afternoon, had already seen something like the asphodel meadows. The underworld was, in this way, not an alien geography. It was the familiar world carried to its logical extreme, the thin soil extending without edge, the dim light becoming the permanent condition, the flowers blooming, not for a season, but for as long as there were dead to walk among them, which was as long as there were living people to produce them, which was, the tradition quietly assumed, forever. And out beyond the asphodel, somewhere in the underworld's interior that the tradition described, but no living traveler was meant to reach without guidance, the other regions continued in their own conditions. The afternoon light of Elysium fell on its meadows without progressing toward dusk. The still air of the Isle of the Blessed held the scent of its golden flowers without any wind arriving to carry that scent away. The myrtle grove of the morning fields filtered its dim light through close-growing branches, the shades among the trees moving at their particular slow pace, the silence between them neither companionable nor hostile, but simply the silence of a place where the acute phase of everything has already passed, and at the bottom of everything, below all of it, by the same distance that the bronze anvil measured in its 9-day fall, the Phlegethon moved in its slow circuit around the walls of Tartarus, its orange glow steady in the deep dark, the sounds from inside arriving at their low consistent volume through 3 thicknesses of bronze, the whole system sealed and working as it had always been working, with no interruption the tradition had ever found it necessary to mention. The underworld, in the oldest accounts that described it, was not a temporary arrangement. It was not a holding space or a waiting room for something else. It was a world complete, internally organized, geographically specific, populated according to principles the tradition had worked out in considerable detail across many centuries and many poets. Its regions were distinct, its landscapes were particular, its air was its own kind of air, and its light was its own kind of light, or its own particular quality of the absence of light, which in the asphodel plain was not darkness, but something more like the permanent condition of an overcast afternoon that has no intention of becoming evening. The tradition held that this world was as old as the world above it, that it had been there since the first division of the cosmos, when the 3 brothers drew their portions and one received everything beneath, and the sounds that came through the walls of Tartarus arrived at their consistent muffled volume into the outer underworld, audible across the still air of the asphodel plain. Fainter with each step a traveler took away from those walls and toward the more open and populated regions of the dead's broad country, fading finally into something that was simply part of the ambient condition of a place where everything that had been sound in the living world had settled into a much longer, quieter register, the register of the underground, the register of distance, the register of everything that continues without requiring anyone still alive to listen. In the underworld's dim interior, in whatever light the underworld permits, an old king sits holding a golden scepter. The scepter is not raised. It rests in his hand the way a familiar thing rests, its weight distributed across a palm that has known its weight for a very long time, the gold worn smooth in the places where the grip has always fallen. Around him, the dead press close in a loose and patient crowd, gathering the way people gather when they are waiting to hear something that concerns them, without urgency, without noise, simply assembling because the news, when it comes, will matter. This is Minos and the underworld, as Homer found him in the Asterisk Odyssey. Asterisk, not a king of the dead, exactly, but a king among the dead, doing the work he was appointed to do, holding the scepter that marks the office, and attending to the long, slow crowd that has been arriving since the first person died, and will still be arriving when the last one does. Homer does not pause long on this image. He places it in the Asterisk Odyssey. Asterisk as Odysseus moves through the underworld's outer reaches, and he names Minos and his scepter with the same compressed precision he uses for everything he finds there, as though the detail needs only to be touched briefly to be fully present. The golden scepter is specific, not just a scepter, but a golden one, the kind a king of Crete might actually have carried in life, the kind that signals legitimate authority over people who are accustomed to being governed. What the tradition holds is that Minos carried the weight of his Cretan kingship into the underworld with him and set it to work there, judging among the dead with the same care he had once brought to the living. Zeus appointed him to this office, according to the tradition that runs through both Homer and Plato, because in his living years Minos had been the most just and the most legally careful of kings. The craft of judging had been his particular excellence. The underworld found a use for it. It is worth sitting for a moment with the particular quality of what Minos does. He does not punish, he does not assign suffering. What Homer shows him doing is sitting and attending and passing judgment, the work of someone who hears the case and reads it and names where the soul belongs, without the judgment being driven by anything except what is actually there. The crowd around him is patient because this is a patient system. The dead are not in a hurry. They have arrived at a place that operates on an entirely different scale than the one they came from, and the scale allows for patience. The golden scepter turns slowly in the old king's hand. Another shade steps forward. He looks at it with the attention of someone who has been doing this for a very long time and has not yet found a case that surprised him. Not because the cases are simple, but because he is very good at what he does. Minos sat at the center of the three judges, but the other two were never far from him in the tradition. Rhadamanthus, his brother, occupied his own place in the underworld's judicial arrangement, and Plato, in the Gorgias gives Rhadamanthus a particular quality that sets him apart from a living judge and makes him something this world has no real equivalent for. Rhadamanthus examines souls that arrived stripped of everything: no clothing, no jewelry, no title, no rank, no family standing arranged behind them in testimony to their quality. The soul arriving for judgment before Rhadamanthus arrived exactly as it was, which is to say, it arrived as the accumulated record of its own living. Whatever the life had made of the soul was simply there, visible, the way the grain of wood becomes visible once the surface has been planed smooth. A life spent in careful and just dealing left something harmonious. Plato says, a soul that had a particular visible coherence, its parts in proportion to each other, nothing distorted from its proper shape. A life spent otherwise left something else entirely. Plato describes this with a specificity that is precise without being cruel. The soul marked by the deeds it carried, the marks themselves reflecting the nature of those deeds, so that what the judge was reading was not an accusation, but simply a record, the way a tree's rings are a record of its growing years. This is the mechanism that Plato builds most carefully across the Gorgias the Phaedo and the Republic and the mechanism has a particular quality that makes it worth dwelling on in a geography like this one. No flattery could obstruct Rhadamanthus, no wealth, no fine clothing, no family reputation carried over from the living world, the oratory that could sway a living court, that could build a compelling case out of imperfect materials and convince a jury of the thing it wanted to believe. None of that was available here. The soul standing before Rhadamanthus had nothing to offer except what it actually was, and what it actually was would be visible. Plato finds in this arrangement something that he considers the only genuinely just judgment possible, because it is the only situation in which the subject of the judgment has nowhere to hide. Everything that obscures genuine character in life, the beautiful face, the well-cut robe, the family whose honorable name attaches itself to a less honorable heir, all of it stays on the near shore when the soul crosses. What arrives before the judge is what there actually is. The third judge, Acus, brought to his office a quality that the tradition associates with him specifically, an even-handedness so widely recognized in his living years that it drew visitors from far outside his own kingdom. In life, he had ruled the island of Aegina with a particular patience. The tradition describes other Greek kings coming to him with their disputes, crossing the Aegean to reach a man whose reputation for impartial judgment was known across the whole of the Greek world. There is an image in this that carries its own quiet weight. An old king sitting under an open sky on an island, hearing a dispute that has been carried to him across the water because everyone agreed that the person most likely to get it right was this particular man in this particular place, under no obligation to favor either party. The disputes that reached a caucus were the ones that could not be resolved closer to home, because there was no one closer to home whose judgment both parties trusted equally. He was the court of last resort for the living. The underworld found a use for that too. Aeacus, in certain versions of the tradition, also held the keys to the underworld, not just a judge, but a gatekeeper, the one who held authority over the threshold, in the same way he had held authority over the threshold between disputing parties in his living years. The two functions sit comfortably together. A man who spent his life determining which way a thing ought to go, who held the power to open the way in one direction and close it in another, carries that into the underworld with him and discovers that the underworld has the same basic need. Every great institution needs someone who can be trusted with the keys. Aeacus was trusted with the keys of Aegina when he was alive. The same quality that made him trustworthy there made him right for this. The three judges together, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, formed what Plato in the asterisk Gorgias asterisk describes as a deliberate arrangement, established by Zeus when he recognized that the judgment of the dead required exactly the conditions that living judgment could never fully achieve. Living judgment has too many variables. The defendant can be present in a way that influences the jury, regardless of the merits of the case. The judge can be swayed by what they see. The record of a life is not visible the way the grain of wood is visible. It has to be assembled from testimony, which is subject to all the distortions that testimony carries with it. Plato clearly found this deeply unsatisfying. The Gorgias's account of the underworld's judicial system has the quality of a correction, as though Plato looked at the ordinary machinery of Athenian justice, found it consistently and almost comically inadequate to the task of measuring what a person actually was, and decided that the only genuinely just system would have to operate in a world stripped of every material advantage that allowed unjust people to get away with things. The underworld in this reading is not where justice ends. It is where justice finally, after all the delays and distortions and complications of living, actually begins. What the judges were reading in Plato's account was not the content of specific actions exactly, but the form the soul had taken on through those actions accumulated over a lifetime. This is a subtle distinction, and one that the tradition takes seriously. A soul that had spent its living years dealing honestly, that had practiced the habit of considering others and attending carefully to what was fair, would have developed a particular shape, a coherence, an internal harmony between its parts that was the natural product of living that way. The tradition holds that this shape was genuinely beautiful to the judge's eyes, not decoratively but structurally, the way a well-proportioned thing is beautiful. A soul that had spent its years otherwise would carry the marks of that, not as external decorations or punishments added at the moment of judgment, but as the natural result of what those years had built. The judges were not deciding. They were reading what was already decided by the life itself. The judgment at the crossroads was the life's own final accounting with itself, made visible in the only place where vision of this kind was possible. The road from the judges led to the crossroads. Plato's asterisk, Phaedo, asterisk, describes it with a precision that suggests someone who has thought carefully about how the underworld's geography would actually have to work in order to do what the tradition claimed it did. 3 roads diverged from a central point. Each one was distinct. Each one led to a specific place within the underworld's interior, and the soul arriving at the crossroads after judgment had already received, in the judgment itself, the reading that would name which road belonged to it. The road to the right and upward moved toward Elysium, toward the landscape of sustained afternoon light and unhurried ease, where the virtuous dead were said to spend whatever time they spent there. The road downward and to the left moved toward Tartarus, the sealed depth where the Phlegethon's flames moved in a visible circuit, and the sounds from within the walls arrived from a distance, as a low continuous texture on the still air. The middle road moved toward the Asphodel Meadows, or the Acherusian Lake, toward the wide neutral territory, where souls requiring further passage or further reflection waited in the dim light among the pale flowers that grew across the ground. What the crossroads looked like in the underworld's interior is a question the tradition does not answer with great visual specificity, but the asterisk Phaedo asterisk gives it enough to work with. A central point, 3 roads extending away from it into the dim distance, each one clear enough to walk without uncertainty. Not hidden paths or difficult terrain, but actual roads, the kind that have been there long enough to be well established, the kind that are there because they need to be there and have been used continuously. The crossroads has a particular quality of stillness that the geography around it does not disrupt. It sits in the underworld's interior, the way a crossroads in the living world sits, as the point where the question of direction resolves itself, where the ambiguity of travel between one place and another is replaced by the clarity of a named choice. A soul arriving at this point after judgment has already had the answer. The crossroads simply makes it spatial, gives it direction, turns the outcome of a life into a literal road leading somewhere specific under what serves for light in this particular country. The tradition holds that the crossroads had been there from very close to the beginning of the underworld's organization, as a place, which is to say, from very close to the beginning of the gods' governance of the world after the defeat of the Titans. When Hades received his portion of the cosmos, the subterranean realm pressing downward beneath everything else, what he received was not an empty darkness waiting to be furnished, but a place with its own requirements, its own internal logic, its own geography that would need to develop in proportion to the need it served. Rivers had to run through it. A threshold had to stand at the point of entry. A system of judgment had to be established. A crossroads had to be placed at the point where judgment resolved into destination. The tradition describes all of this as having been arranged, not hastily or provisionally, but with the thoroughness of a ruler who understood that what he had been given was going to last as long as the world itself, and had to be built accordingly. Hades, which in the ancient Greek named both the god and the place with the same single word, was never a temporary arrangement. It was the permanent address of the permanently dead, designed to function for as long as there were dead to inhabit it. Somewhere in the underworld, the judges are still working. The tradition does not describe them as having stopped. There is no account of a time when Minos set down the golden scepter, or Rhadamanthus concluded that he had read enough souls to have finished the task, or Acus passed the keys to someone else. The institution continues because the institution has to continue, because the dead continue to arrive, and the system was built to receive them. Every new shade that crosses the boundary river and passes through the threshold where Cerberus watches makes its way eventually to the place of judgment. And at the place of judgment, one of the 3 old kings applies the same unhurried attention he has always applied, reads what is there with the same clear sight, and the judgment is made in the same way it has always been made, because the nature of the soul does not change between one generation and the next, only the particular accumulation of choices that shaped it. There is something in this that the tradition seems to find genuinely stabilizing, rather than heavy. The system operates continuously because it was built to operate continuously, because the need it serves is continuous, because the dead are a constituency that never stops growing and has to be served by an institution that grows with it. Plato's various descriptions of the underworld's judicial arrangement carry this quality, the confidence of someone describing a system that works, not the anxiety of someone describing a system that might break down. The judges are good at what they do. The roads are clearly marked. The destinations are specific and known. The souls arrive and are read and are sent where they belong, and the same process begins again with the next one and the next, in the same way a river moves steadily in one direction, because the grade of the ground beneath it makes any other direction impossible. The crossroads itself, standing at the point where the three roads diverge, has a particular quality that runs through all the accounts that describe it. It is not a place of waiting so much as a place of resolution. A soul arrives there already carrying the outcome. The judgment is complete, the reading is done, and what remains is only to begin walking in the direction the reading has named. The crossroads does not prolong anything. It ends the question of direction by making direction visible, giving the soul a road whose character matches the character of the judgment, and whose destination is specific and ready to receive whatever arrives. The road to the right continues upward into a light that is slow and sustained, and nothing like the variable light of the living world, which is always moving toward something, toward noon, toward evening, toward a sunrise not yet arrived. The light of Elysium does not move toward anything. It is simply there, complete, the way a thing is complete when nothing is required to change it. The road to the left moves downward into the deeper dark, where the phlogathon burns its cold fire in a wide circle, its flames providing no warmth, its light a moving orange glow visible from a distance rather than a source of illumination that reaches anywhere. Taurus's walls are sealed. The sounds from within, the low continuous texture of iron and stone, and voice arrive from outside them as something heard rather than witnessed, the way thunder arrives before the storm. The tradition is careful about this. The walls hold. The road to the left leads to the walls, and the walls hold everything they were built to hold, which means the souls sent that way arrive at a threshold that has never failed to receive them, a containment as total and permanent as the rest of the underworld's geography. The middle road moves across the wider ground of the Asphodel Meadows, or toward the Acherusian Lake, which sits in Plato's asterisk, Phaedo asterisk, as a wide and patient body of water where souls requiring further time or further reflection wait in a dimness that is neither the darkness of Taurus nor the sustained light of Elysium, but something in the middle, which is appropriate because the souls it holds are themselves in the middle, neither one thing clearly nor the other, working through whatever portion of their situation remains to be worked through, in the unhurried way the underworld permits things to be worked through, in a time that does not move the way living time moves. From the crossroads, all three roads can be seen extending into the underworld's interior, each one distinct, each one occupied. Souls move along each one in a steady, unhurried progress, the way water moves in a slow river, without the urgency that characterizes movement in the living world, where destinations are uncertain and time is limited, and the distance between one place and another is always in some tension with the time available to cross it. Here, the distance does not press. The road simply continues in its direction, and the soul walking it simply continues in the same direction, and the destination receives each arrival with the patience of a place that has been waiting since it was established, and will continue waiting because waiting is simply the condition of being permanently in one place. The crossroads in Plato's account was the point where the geography of the underworld resolved into something morally legible. Every other feature of this realm, the rivers, the threshold, the regions on the far side of the boundary, all of them existed in some relationship to each other that the crossroads made visible. The rivers brought souls to the threshold. The threshold opened onto the passage toward judgment. The judgment named the road. The road led to the destination. The destination was the geography already in place, waiting to receive whatever the judgment sent. The crossroads stood at the center of this sequence, not as the most important point in it, but as the point where the sequence became directional, where the abstract outcome of a judgment became a literal movement through space in a particular way. The soul leaving the crossroads was not leaving behind the judgment, or the reading, or the accumulated record of its life. It was carrying all of that into the destination those things had earned, and the destination was simply the part of the underworld that corresponded to what the life had actually been. This is the logic the tradition built across several centuries of telling. It is not a simple logic, and it is not a single logic. Homer's version, and Hesiod's version, and Plato's version, and Virgil's version all arrange the pieces differently, weight certain features more than others, add details or remove them, or contradict each other on specific points in ways that scholars have been mapping carefully for a very long time without fully resolving. What runs through all of them, though, despite these differences, is the basic structure that the underworld was organized, that the organization served a purpose, that the purpose was to receive the dead and situate them according to what they had been, and that the process for doing this was both specific and continuous. No version of the tradition describes the underworld as confused or temporary or likely to be replaced by something better. They all describe it as permanent. Minos still holds the golden scepter. The crowd around him is not the same crowd it was in Homer's time, but it has the same quality, patient, gathered, waiting to hear what they are told so they can go where they need to go. The scepter turns in the old king's hand. Another shade steps into the space before him and stands quietly, stripped of everything except what it has always been, in the only place where that is fully visible. Minos looks at it. He has the expression of someone doing work they were made for, not enthusiasm exactly, not tedium exactly, but the particular settled attention of a craftsman who has been doing the same craft long enough that it has become part of his disposition rather than a task he has to remind himself to perform. He looks at the shade for as long as looking takes. Then he speaks. Rhadamanthus, somewhere in the underworld's interior, reads another soul with the same clarity. What the life made is visible here. The harmonious soul and the disordered soul look different to him, the way one piece of wood looks different from another. Once the surface has been stripped, the difference is inherent, not applied, and no amount of pleading changes it, because pleading would require a different kind of judge than the one who sits here in the dim light, reading what is actually present. He has been doing this since the beginning of this arrangement. He will continue. Aeacus, who once sat under an open sky on Agana, with the disputes of neighboring kingdoms laid before him, now sits in the underworld with the same even-handedness he brought to that island court, and the keys he holds in certain versions of the tradition rest in his hands with the same ease as the golden scepter rests in Minos's, familiar, functional, worn smooth from long use. The courts of the underworld do not close. The threshold the keys govern does not stop receiving arrivals. The system Plato describes in the asterisk Gorgias, asterisk as the corrected version of living justice, the version that finally achieves what living justice always attempted and never quite managed, continues operating in the same unhurried way it has always operated, in a place where time does not press and the work never runs out, and the crossroads stands at the point where the three roads diverge. From the crossroads, all of it is visible, the path going right and upward toward the slow golden light, the path going left and downward toward the faint orange glow of Tartarus's perimeter, the path going forward across the wide and asphodel-covered ground toward the Acherusian lake and its patient shore. Each road is worn smooth from long use, smooth enough that whatever serves for light here catches the surface of each one and makes it distinguishable from the ground on either side, makes it clearly a road rather than simply a direction. Souls move along each one steadily, some recently departed from the crossroads, and still close enough that their shapes are distinct, others farther along and visible only as a quality of movement in the dim middle distance, and others so far ahead that what remains is only the sense of the road continuing, the suggestion of its destination somewhere ahead of them in the interior of a world that has been receiving exactly this kind of steady traffic since before any living person could remember. The tradition describes all of this as having been in place since the earliest organization of the cosmos. Hades received the subterranean realm and made of it what it needed to be, and the rivers ran, and the threshold stood, and the judges sat, and the crossroads waited at the center of everything for the roads that diverged from it to do their patient work. The system as Plato imagined it had been running continuously, without interruption and without revision, since the moment it was established. It did not need revision. The souls it received were always the same in the way that matters. They were always the accumulated record of a life's choices, and the choices always produced a shape that was readable, and the readable shape always corresponded to one of the roads at the crossroads, and the roads always led to the same destinations they had always led to, the same geography sitting at the end of each one, complete and specific and ready. From the crossroads, the whole of the underworld's interior stretches away in the three directions the roads name. The scale is the scale of a world beneath a world, which is to say, it is a scale for which the living world offers no reliable comparison. The rivers running through it are wider and longer than any river above the earth. The asphodel meadows extend to no clear boundary. Elysium holds its slow light across ground that does not measure itself in the units available to a field or a valley. Tartarus sits at its distance, with its walls intact and its sounds arriving faintly across the still air between them and wherever the listener stands. And at the center of all of this, at the crossroads where three roads diverge into three distinct portions of this vast interior, the system continues its patient and unhurried work. The judges reading, the roads receiving, the destinations waiting, the whole arrangement doing exactly what it was built to do, without rush and without conclusion, in the particular darkness of a place that was made permanent from the beginning and has simply been permanent ever since. The sounds from Tartarus arrive very faintly here, so faintly that they are more like the memory of sound than sound itself, a low texture at the edge of what can be heard, arriving across the still underworld air from a very great distance. At the crossroads, this far from the outer threshold, and this far from the sealed walls, the air between the three diverging roads is quiet in the way the underworld's interior is always quiet, not the silence of an empty place, but the particular quiet of a very large place that is very steadily occupied, where nothing is moving faster than it needs to move, and nothing is demanding attention it has not already been given. The roads extend forward into their respective landscapes.